I'd like to introduce Steven Sonnenstein. He is the Managing Director at Digital Colony, and he is here because we requested someone from Digital Colony to speak about just the general overview of what's going on in the industry and how it all affects all of us and what we're doing in our daily lives. And I think you'll find his presentation really interesting. So without further ado, Steven.
Colony Capital, we are a digital infrastructure platform and part of the broader Colony Capital group. So today, Colony Capital has about $49 billion under management. We have 400 employees. We span the globe with 21 different locations, and we've been doing and investing in the sector for over 28 years, broadly speaking. But who is really Digital Colony? Digital Colony is an amalgamation of digital infrastructure assets. We manage over 135,000 route miles of fiber, 95 data centers, 35,000 small cell nodes, and we own and operate 350,000 tower sites around the world. We do this across the Americas and in Europe, and we solely focus on this, contrary to other infrastructure investors who might look at transportation, energy, and the like. We just solely focus on these assets for the plain and simple reason that this is part of our DNA. It's what we've been doing for over 2 decades and have experience and operational know-how that we bring to bear in all of our investments. So who is more specifically Digital Colony? We have 11 investment platforms spanning 4 different asset classes: data centers, wireless towers, and small cells and fiber. Today, that amounts to about $19 billion under management, and we've accomplished all of this through over 300 individual M&A transactions. And I'll explain a little bit more about that in a second. So what we aim to do is we aim to bring permanent capital to the sector to allow our end user customers the ability to manage their businesses in an efficient manner. We're patient capital. We focus on our customer relationships and bring our operational know-how and operational partners to help support our businesses across all of our investment platforms. What is key and what is critical for that is that we have the capacity to support our investments without any hesitation. We have a strong balance sheet that supports our investments, and as such, when the need arises, which I'm sure all of you can appreciate, this sector is a tremendous need for capital, and it's growing day by day. So if you're able to do that and able to support your customer base through continued investment, that in turn will translate to success for the end user. So how do we do this and how do we create value? We do it really across these 6 pillars, and this is the foundation of what our business is all about. We focus on recruiting the top talent in the industry, but more specifically, we focus on recruiting operational experts, people who have actually operated these businesses and can bring that experience to the table and allow us to manage our businesses more efficiently. Contrary to other investors or your more traditional general partners who might manage their businesses from the board level, we tend to get involved in the day-to-day operations as needed, but more specifically, we follow our investments very closely and work very closely with the management teams to streamline the operations, increase efficiency, and increase their operational excellence. We have experienced individuals within the organization that have been CEOs of these types of businesses before. They sit on our boards, they get involved with management and help drive the business forward. We've developed our own proprietary back office systems, which we run all of our businesses across. It's a cloud-based system that allows basically tremendous scalability of these platforms, regardless of geography or currency or language for that matter. And then more specifically, what we do is we have a very distinctive M&A strategy. So when I mentioned before 300 plus acquisitions, those acquisitions can be as big as $1 million or they can be as big as $1 billion. It doesn't matter. What we do is we drive operational flow of transactional operational flow through our businesses and integrate these small little tuck-in M&As very efficiently, which allow us to achieve scale and drive down our entry multiples. We have a strong balance sheet, as I mentioned before, and we also have a very creative way of financing these businesses. We don't over-lever them, but we do things such as securitizations, where we pioneered securitizations in the tower sector. We've done this in the data center universe, as well as in the small cell fiber business that we own. These have never been done before, but they're very efficient ways of financing your businesses and allow you to free up a lot of capital to continue to reinvest. And of course, we're very focused on ESG and focused on our communities and working very closely with our partners in providing responsible investment, and we aim to invest with a zero carbon footprint. The nature of our businesses are very heavily dependent on energy, so we're all constantly looking for ways to increase efficiency and look for new ways to power our businesses. So more specifically about the universe that we're in, and this is probably one of the most interesting things that every time I give one of these presentations and I look at one of these slides, the numbers always change. And it's really telling about the sector and the industry that we're in. It's in constant evolution, constant flux. It's continuously growing. And that's the plain and simple reason for that is just the sheer creation of data. And I'll talk about that in a minute. But just if we look at these numbers for a second, so 2018, I think this is the last statistic, 3.6 billion mobile users in the world. So there's only 47, which was 47% penetration of the world's population. Now, if you think about that, it's a staggering number, but it just gives you a sense of how much there is still left to grow, how much more is still available in terms of percentage growth for mobile users in the world today. I'm sure all of you can attest to, it's a lot easier to hand somebody a mobile phone than it is to lay a copper cable to their residence or to their business. So in parts of the world that are not well served by legacy copper networks, what we're finding and what we're seeing is mobile is the way that is going to get these people connected. It's much easier to install a tower. The only challenges you might have is getting fiber to these locations or getting power to them. But ultimately, it just gives you a sense of how much growth is still available. The expectation is that this will grow to 5 billion by 2025. So if you just look at that in terms of numbers, that's an incremental 1.4 billion users that we're expecting to get online and start creating data and communicating and connecting with one another. But what's going to drive all of this and what really stands out is the amount of capex and the amount of investment that's going to be required for 5G. So 482 billion is the current estimate of the amount of capex that's going to be required to be invested between 2018 and 2020 alone in order to get 5G up and rolling. But if you look at that and look at where that investment is going to take place, the expectation is in 2020 that 123 billion of the 160 billion that's expected to be invested will be invested in the US and South Korea, leaving 37 billion to the rest of the world. So over a fifth of the world's markets will have launched 5G by 2020, and it's still a very, very small percentage. But what's going to really drive the growth is the Internet of Things, is the connected devices, whether it's your televisions, your refrigerators, your washing machines that are all of a sudden going to turn around and order detergent because it realizes that it's out, or, for example, your appliances will all of a sudden start talking to one another to run more efficiently. We'll start talking to the utility, and we'll start cycling power on and off as we roll out smart grids. The number of connected devices is literally going to triple to 25.2 billion. This number was, I think, about 3 or 4 billion lower last year when I gave this presentation. So these constantly getting updated. But what's really interesting is that if you look at the smartphones, today there's 43% of all smartphone connections in the world are on 4G. By 2025, only 1.4 billion of the smartphones in use in the world will be 5G enabled, or not 5G enabled, but rather on 5G. So that's only 15%. So you still have a massive amount of capex and a massive amount of investment that's going to be required in order to get all of this up and running and connected. What does all this mean? This is probably the most important thing that I wanted to share with all of you today. Today in 2020, we see 2.3 zettabytes of IP traffic that's being generated. So that's from your desktops, or basically a wired connection. That being said, the expectation this year is that 600 zettabytes of data will be generated from IoT devices or mobile devices. That's a tremendous number. So a zettabyte is 1 billion terabytes. So that's 600 billion terabytes of data are expected to be generated. And what's really interesting about this is that most of this needs to be stored. At least half of it will have to reside somewhere in some data center, will have to be transmitted across spectrum, across fiber, and ultimately stored. What's even more interesting is that 90% of this data was created in the last 2 years, and that time frame keeps shrinking. Basically, every single day there's 2.5, I can't remember the number, quintillions, I think it's called, quintillion bytes of data that are being created every single day. That's basically a 1 with 18 zeros after it. And this is all being created by ourselves, by the consumption of data and media and content, whether it's a self-driving car or it's the downloading of a Netflix movie. Most recent statistic that Netflix released was that their customer base, or I think it's Americans, spend about 12 hours a day consuming media, consuming content over their devices. And that's anything from work to obviously movies and Facebook and everything of that sort. So what will 5G do to our society? It's probably the single greatest investment in the sector in our lifetimes, for sure. It's really going to change the way we work and the way we live and operate day to day. What's amazing to me is not so long ago in my lifetime, I didn't even have a mobile phone, and I would need to walk around with quarters in my pocket so that I could call my mom and tell her where I am. Today, if my daughter's Life 360 doesn't update instantaneously and I don't know where she is, I start to freak out. And that's because we have this inherent need and desire to be connected and to know what's going on at every single instance of the day and where people are, what people are doing. And we have this need for instant gratification from our devices. So 5G is going to remove all forms of latency that we are used to today. You will no longer have the little spinning wheel as you try to download a movie. A movie that now today could take 15 to 20 minutes to download from iTunes will be downloaded in 2 to 3 seconds, if that long. But more importantly, what it's going to allow is for things like self-driving cars or even self-driving planes. I know that sounds scary, but it's actually almost a reality to take place, because we're going to be able to have such low latency in everything that we do. It's going to allow us to be a lot more efficient in our energy consumption. We're going to be able to manage our energy grids a lot more efficiently. But the one thing that I want all of you to really focus on is the 7 trillion devices or things that will be connected. That's really the crux of it, and that's what's going to drive this need and this demand for all of this investment. Everything from your home to access systems, to your cars, to your appliances, to your computers, everything's going to be connected. And AI is really going to catapult most of this, because that's the compute that's going to drive how we manage all of these things. So what is this world of convergence going to look like, and what does this all mean for 5G? It's the sheer amount of data consumption, which I sort of touched on, and the billions and billions of bytes of data that we create every single day and every single instance in what we do, that is going to need an investment in bandwidth and an investment in reliability of all these networks. So it's really going to transform the way we work. It's going to transform the way we play, the way we travel, the way we transport goods from point A to point B, the way we warehouse things. If any of you have had the opportunity to look at the way Amazon runs one of their warehouses, it's incredibly automated, and AI is driving a lot of the way they manage their businesses. All of this requires compute. All of this requires a lot of investment in the infrastructure that drives all of this. And this is what we do. We invest in that infrastructure on a neutral host basis. And that is really where the world is going, is that the traditional investors in the sector, who used to be the telecom companies, will struggle to continue to support this investment in the future. It is inefficient. It's a legacy way of doing business, and we respect it. We want to work in partnership with all of our customers to allow them to focus on their business, which is providing services to you, the end consumer. It's not very efficient for a telecom company to invest in a single tower where they're a single tenant. It's a very inefficient use of their balance sheet. It would be much more efficient for them to share this infrastructure. And it's something that's happening. It's happening around the world. It's happening south of the border in Latin America. It's still a little slow to get adopted here in the U.S. For many reasons, which we won't get into today. But at the end of the day, the end consumer is driving the demand for more services and a better technology and investment in 5G. So if everybody needed to invest in their own 5G network, we would never get there. So this will require, as I said, neutral host providers. It's going to require basically collaboration between all of the users of this infrastructure so that they can all turn around and focus on their end consumer as opposed to focusing on their infrastructure. A tower is a tower is a tower, and the antennas are pretty much becoming a very standardized piece of equipment depending on the manufacturer that you use. At the end of the day, you, the end consumer, I don't think really cares how you get connected to your network. You don't really care whether it's an AT&T or a T-Mobile tower that you're connected to. You just want to be connected. So what you're interested in is, what are you getting in terms of service? Are you getting reliable, fast, low latency service? Are you able to get additional services from your providers, additional content, and things like that? So it's not a great way to invest in your business, but at the end of the day, it's necessary in order for us to evolve and to take things to the next level. This is a great little use case that will give you a sense of how data is being created, or how much is being created. This is what I would describe as a level 1 self-driving car, autonomous car. Generates 4 terabytes of data in a given day. The autonomous cars like that we will end up seeing that in our lifetime, the Jetson kind that just drive themselves, or I can't seem to think of, or Minority Report is another one where the car just goes and drives up the side of buildings. Maybe not there yet, but anyways, those level of cars that really will work within a network of self-driving cars will require probably about 3 times more. Will generate 3 times more amounts of data in a given day. And this is whether, it just give you a sense of it between the LiDAR, the GPS, the sonar, the radar, and the cameras that are required to get a car like this driving autonomously within traffic and within a city will require all of this infrastructure in order to work. You'll need a baseband controller, a small cell on a lamppost, but many of them, you'll need one every couple of feet. You'll need this to get connected back to a tower. You'll need an edge data center probably to run this compute, and then all the way going back to a NOC that'll basically drive, where the AI will help drive the car itself through the network. This assumes, I think, if I'm not mistaken, about 8 hours a day of usage. But if you can imagine, if we had a city full of self-driving cars that were operating 24 hours a day, that becomes an exponential number. The other thing that's interesting is that data for self-driving cars needs to be stored. All of it needs to be stored for security reasons, insurance, highway safety, etc. So if you can imagine one car generating 4 terabytes, or even a more advanced one generating 12 terabytes of data a day, multiply that by 100, by 1,000, by 1,000,000 self-driving cars, and all of that needs to be communicated, transmitted, and stored. We're going to need a lot more capacity. So what is digital infrastructure? It's another utility, essentially. It's no different than an electricity company or an energy grid, but it's a very necessary piece of infrastructure that requires a level of reliability that is unlike almost any other type of infrastructure. We will have to maintain a 5.9 standard in order to service our customers, and our customers depend on this. If we do not provide that 5.9 standards, we're dead. It's simple. We will lose credibility. Our customers will leave us. And ultimately, at the end of the day, they'll either do it themselves or they'll find somebody who will deliver that. Data centers can never go down. They have to be able to operate. So the level of redundancy that you'll find in your data centers, or even in your tower networks or your fiber networks, is something that is unparalleled. The power goes out, what really happens? Yes, there are consequences for it, but it's not really the end of the world. If you're running a self-driving car, the data center cannot go down, because that would be disastrous. So you need to be able to continue to provide that reliability, and you need to know how to do it. You need to have the operational expertise to do it, and you need to be able to support that investment and continued investment in your infrastructure in order to ensure that there are no slip-ups, there are no mishaps. So that's the opportunity set, and that's what's really exciting about the world that we're in and the technology that's coming about. But I have to throw up a little bit of a cautionary note because there's a lot of capital that's basically running into this sector and continuing to invest in the sector itself. And we've seen valuations get to levels that I've never seen before in my lifetime. And there's a lot of warning signs here that few people are following. The most recent staggering piece of data that I came across was a recent data center transaction that took place in Southeast Asia, where I believe the implied multiple, acquisition multiple, was 58 times installed EBITDA. Yes, I said 58 times. Who's running after this and who's investing this? Right now, digital infrastructure it's in vogue. It's a sexy place to put money. People want to do it. Everyone's doing it, so everybody's trying to do it. But when you go and invest at 58 times, it is impossible for you to drive down that acquisition multiple, even if you do a few hundred M&A transactions in that business. It's just, you'll never see the return levels that you need. So what happens is when you're buying these assets at those levels and putting in leverage onto those businesses to support those astronomical purchase prices, well, ultimately interest rates are going to go up. And then when that happens, this little house of cards is likely to fall down. So what we've seen now for the first time in history is fiber companies are trading at a higher multiple than tower companies, and that is really scary. The whole premise and the underlying business of a fiber company, an enterprise fiber company for that matter, relative to a tower company, is night and day. Your tower company is supported by long-term contracts, generally 10, 15, 20 years, and backed by strong counterparties that are basically investment-grade tenants to your businesses. So those would dictate, arguably, a stronger valuation and a much stronger multiple. But when you compare that to an enterprise fiber company, where the contract durations can be as short as 1 year, and your customer stickiness is not quite the same, and people are willing to pay 20 times for that, I'm not really sure what they're banking on. But it's just something that we're just watching and sitting on the sidelines and allowing a lot of these transactions to go by. Because if we were to chase them the way many people are, I don't think we'd be here next year. Right now, brownfield M&A is 1 to 3 times more expensive to buy than build. And this is these premiums that people are paying versus replacement cost. It just gives us a sense that we are truly at the top of the cycle. So what's the answer? Well, the answer is obviously to invest with us. That goes without saying. But ultimately, what it really means is that you want to partner with the right people. You want to partner with people that understand these businesses, that have had the experience of providing 5 nines reliability and uptime to their customers, and that can continue to invest and support these businesses throughout their investment cycle and throughout their operational cycle. If you are on shaky footing and you partner with the wrong people, ultimately the end consumer who will suffer, and their businesses will not be able to provide the service that ultimately their customers are used to receiving. So whether it's a macro tower network or a small cell network or a data center, again, operating these at the utmost level of efficiency remains fundamentally what we aim to deliver and aim to do. So you need to make sure that you continue to partner with the right people in these for these types of investments, certainly into the next cycle and into the next few years, where investment pouring into the sector will achieve astronomical levels. And this is my joke of the day. Bottom line is everything's moving to the cloud, so probably solar is probably not a good place to put your money. Anyways, thank you very much for your time. And hopefully I gave you a little bit of insight into the world to come. Thank you.
Property owner, what is the infrastructure that you should be putting in? Number 1. Number 2, thanks, Rich. Number 2 is can you kind of dissect what's going on in terms of 5G and our friends in China and what the United States government asked us all to do this week, which was to invest in other competitive technologies?
Sure. So it's really interesting. What's happening with real estate or property owners is really interesting. All of these LEED certified buildings that everybody is putting up are great. They're highly efficient, but at the same time, they're steel boxes that no signal can penetrate. Companies are no longer investing in landlines. Most banks today only provide a mobile phone to their employees. People don't have desks, they telework, etc. So ultimately what all of that means is, and I'm sure some of you can appreciate this, is your gold LEED certified building or platinum has gas in between the window panes of the building, and that gas does not allow any mobile signal to travel through. So at the end of the day, what does this mean is that if you want to attract tenants to your buildings, you want to attract a long-term tenant who's going to take up a large amount of space from you, you need to allow them to be able to connect. So you need to have strong connectivity within your building. You need to install a DAS system in your building that ultimately the carriers will broadcast their signals over and will allow for phones to work as much on the floors, in the elevator shafts, and so on. We own a business that actually does this in the US and in the UK. And what we're finding is it's a very different investment proposition. Landlords obviously don't want to pay for it. The mobile carriers don't want to pay for it. The customers don't want to pay for it. So what does all that mean? Who ends up paying for it at the end of the day? It's the tenants. In the UK, we're seeing these costs being passed through to the tenants to install these systems, and landlords are attracting tenants to their buildings by offering installed connectivity in their buildings. So what you can do is ensure that you have a fiber-connected, mobile-friendly building to offer to the market, and that will differentiate you over the next building that is a steel box that nothing gets in and out of. There's nothing more frustrating than being on a call, walking into a building, having the call drop, or being on a call, walking to the elevator shaft and having the call drop. And you're sitting there sort of standing, holding your phone by the door of the elevator at the hopes that that will improve your connectivity, which it doesn't. To answer your question about China, so what the Chinese are doing is actually they're investing probably 10 times as much as we will into 5G. And it's a race. It's a race for 5G connectivity right now. So there's not much we can do to invest more in it. This is something that the infrastructure owners and the telcos need to go after. But the Chinese are really trying to capitalize on it right now and invest very heavily into that. There is, yes, I did read, like everybody else, the I wouldn't call it speculation, but the arguments that were made this past week in the news about the types of technology and equipment that Chinese manufacturers are using versus Ericsson or Nokia, let's say, European-based. And it's a race between us and China for now is investing a lot more than we are.
So, Steven, I have a question. So, from the standpoint of Digital Colony and what you're doing for your investors, what is the play from a profit and loss standpoint? Are you playing this to make profits on the individual companies? Are you playing it for a long-term hold? Are you playing it for a buy and flip? What's the scheme that you folks are thinking?
Well, we always hope to make money. Our LPs would be very unhappy if we didn't, and our franchise would not survive. That said, we are long-term patient capital. Our fund is a 10-year fund. 9-year fund with 2 one-year extensions, so let's call it all in 11 years. But ultimately what we aim to do is invest in these businesses, capitalize them, help them grow, and then ultimately divest of them or have them evolve into some new form of existence. But ultimately it's an investment platform which we aim to grow and capitalize on.
Right. So you are working towards growing these businesses, but there's a lot of capital that goes into it. So what is the time frame that it takes for you to be able to see a profit for your limiteds in this situation, if you're long-term patient capital, does it turn over fairly quickly, or is it something that takes a long part of the cycle? What's your take on the timing piece of this?
The quick answer is it depends. It depends on which market. Investing in LATAM is not the same as investing in North America or Europe. Each one of these businesses has a different capital investment profile. Ultimately, our investors are accustomed or have signed up to the duration that we've marketed. And it really depends. Honestly, it really depends on the market. LATAM is growing at a much faster pace than we are in North America. That said, some markets around the world are still just deploying 4G today. So, and other markets are still on 3G. So what's going to happen is you're going to see some markets catapult over to 5G and just skip over 4G. Others are going to continue to deploy 4G because they've already started and the standards are in place, and it's probably just a little easier for them to continue to do that. But at the end of the day, within our investment period of 9 years, we do expect to exit these investments.
And so are there, from the standpoint of the big buckets that you've got, you have towers, you have fiber, and you have data centers. Are there other things
and small cells?
Small cells. That's the four. That would be a fourth.
Those are the fourth, yeah.
Yeah. Are there other pieces of this beyond those four buckets that the company is investing in?
There are other sectors that we continue to look at. We continue to monitor the entire digital infrastructure ecosystem. We have a fairly long analysis period before we invest in a sector. So let's take, for example, satellites. We've been studying satellites for the last 5-7 years. It's an interesting area. We haven't made an investment yet, but it's something that we continue to monitor and track. Subsea cables is another example. We continue to monitor and track those. So the ecosystem is a little bigger than what we have, but what we will continue to do is just remain focused on digital infrastructure because that's what we understand.
That's the giant bucket.
That's the giant bucket. This lady had a question.
Sorry.
Actually, I had two questions. So I'm interested in, of course, who pays, right? So, that's the age-old question, but I'm interested in hearing a little bit more about, you mentioned the tenant pays, and what does that model look like? Is it a cost that's incorporated? In other words, the building owner puts the system in, and then they put that back in a cost to leasing? Or is the user, the tenant, having to do something on their phone to get access where they're paying? How does that model work? That's my first question. And then my second question was, I'm not super technical, but my understanding is you just can't go to 5G without 4G, so you kind of need both. So if you respond to that.
I'll answer the quick one first. You can go to 5G without 4G. They operate on different spectrums. It's a function of the equipment that you install across the infrastructure. Ultimately, a tower is a tower is a tower. You'll put a 2G antenna on a tower, or 4G or a 5G antenna. It's still the same thing. The big difference between all of these technologies is the big difference between all of these technologies is the spectrum that it operates on. So if you'll think back to, I'll try and say this really simplistically, is that you think back to your high school days. Remember those the curves, the sinusoid, and thank you. There you go. So 5G operates over a much longer wavelength, and therefore, 5G operates over a much shorter wavelength, 4G operates over a longer one. And what that translates to for us, the investors, or us, the companies, or you, the landlords, is you need a lot more points of contact for 5G than you did for 4G. So the examples where they say, or where people talk about that you'll need an antenna or node on every single lamppost is almost true. In order to achieve that low latency and that capacity across the network, you do need a lot more points of contact. You need a bigger pipe, essentially, to allow people to communicate across. To your first question, which is the model of how this works, it's literally a flow through to the tenant. It's not the end customer that will pay. So an employee of Goldman Sachs in a building in London will not all of a sudden have to register and pay for connectivity to get connected to the phone. The cost of the equipment to install this within the buildings is fairly low. It's not very expensive. So there's many ways that this can get modeled. Typically, the landlord will pay for the equipment, or there'll be some kind of a cost share or some kind of a like a sale leaseback model. It depends on really the customer's needs, but ultimately this equipment gets funded at the outset, gets put into the building, and then the amount of a chargeback to the end tenant is fairly small. Like I remember I was talking to a landlord of a fairly large building in London, and it's the equivalent of like 2 cents per square foot. It's peanuts. It's really not that expensive.
What would be the time frame? I mean, that does sound
These are
very low.
10-year contracts
Pretty sure
typically.
it's more than that one.
10-year contracts, 10, 15 years. I mean, from my perspective, I'd love it to be 25, but 10 years typically.
Let's say if a landlord wants to put that system inside the building, but then you have certain tenants that do not want to pay for that service. Is there a way to block out that tenant?
Completely. So essentially these indoor systems work per floor. So what happens is the best way to do this is when the building's being built. Obviously, you just run the fiber up the building, and then basically each floor is tenant ready. So if a tenant wants it, then you just install the nodes across the floor. And you can control access. That's really not hard. You can control access to the network. Ultimately, what you're going to find is, depending on whether it's A class, B class, or C class type building, the needs are different. Your typical office building. Those are the examples I was talking about, because that's where we're seeing a lot of traction. There's a lot of these new buildings that are going up. These are the ultimate customers, whether it's a law firm, a bank, or a Google or a Facebook that's taking space in these types of buildings. They don't have desk phones. People don't have them. Everybody's wireless, right? So at the end of the day, what do you need? You need a strong fiber connection. You need strong Wi-Fi, because people are constantly mobile on the office floor plate. They're going around from workstation to workstation. They're collaborating. So you need very strong Wi-Fi. And these buildings were not designed with that in mind. I'll never forget this. I went into a really old building in London. The building was probably 200 years old. There's absolutely no Wi-Fi in the building, and literally I walked through the stone entrance, and that was it. It was dead. There was nothing going through. So that building is going to suffer to attract tenants in the future. And the same thing can be said in the U.S. I mean, our buildings aren't that old, but ultimately a lot of these steel buildings that have very heavy steel construction, they're not very conducive to mobile connectivity.
A great presentation, by the way, very informative. My questions dovetail off of Rich's before. So regarding the M&A business here domestically, what's the average top-line revenue deal size that Digital Colony does? And what's the average time duration for an exit for that company?
It's a great question. So if I told you that we've done deals as small as a couple $100,000, that probably would shock you. But if we own a tower business, for example, which we do, we own a few of them, you can come across an individual, one person who owns one tower in one location, or somebody who owns 5, and we'll go and buy them and just tuck them into our machine. So we can do things as small as $1 million, or even less than that, or a couple $1 million. But we have to do it through our platforms. We will not go and buy a business that's just $1 million business and a standalone that doesn't fit into our ecosystem. That would be very inefficient. A typical investment duration for these, as I said, it's about 7 to 9 years. 9 years is the fund life. So ultimately, we have an undertaking to our LPs to return their capital within that time frame. That said, it really depends on the world we're in and what happens. I mean, people have generally different liquidity needs throughout their investment cycles, but typically, and by and large, it's 7 to 9 years. Did I answer all your questions? That was it. Okay.
So building on John's comments on in-building cellular, I'm curious as to how you view the carrier landscape in the U.S. One of the challenges we're having is that we operate in 8 markets across the country. Carriers take completely different views in every market. So we have one carrier in Boston who's like, we will only do our own deals in buildings. We won't go into anybody's multi-carrier system. Same carrier in Chicago says, oh yeah, we'll go into your multi-carrier system with a third party, no problem. We got another carrier who spent years investing in their own capital and putting DAS systems into buildings, who's now said, we don't like that business anymore, we're getting out of that business, and oh, by the way, we're not upgrading any of your systems at all, good luck. And so, from a building owner perspective, the industry over the last 5-7 years has changed significantly, but it's not at all clear where. The carriers are going in all different directions. One carrier is like, we got no capital anymore, Game of Thrones, very expensive, can't spend money on in-building DAS. Whereas other carriers are saying, we're, recently completed an acquisition, we're now the third big player in the business, we want to put in DAS in every building and we'll spend our capital. So lots of different signals coming from the carriers in lots of different markets. And from a building owner perspective, what's the right way to play that? Because it's awful attractive to take the carrier's money, but on the other hand, you don't control your own destiny.
I'm not surprised. The Europeans are the ones who have taken a totally different approach, and I think that's what's ultimately going to happen here in the U.S. I think we're going to evolve to that. The reason why the carriers have been doing this and teetering from one way to another is because, I don't know if all of you will recall, we used to pay for data, right? And every month you'd be worried about going over your data plan, and then what would happen is the MNOs would then turn around and charge for the excess data. Now we have an all-you-can-eat plans in the U.S. Those have been around actually in Europe for a very long time. And what that does is ultimately you're not competing anymore for, I'm offering you a 5G plan, a 10G plan, a 20G plan a month. You're basically, it's all you can eat. So whether you use 20 or 100, it doesn't really matter. You're paying a fixed price. What people aren't necessarily realizing yet is they're getting throttled back, and they're no longer operating at peak data performance on their mobile devices. That's going to work until a new show like Game of Thrones comes out and somebody's going to get pissed off that they can't stream that anymore. That said, the way to play this ultimately, and you're not going to like the answer, ultimately it's going to fall on the landlords to install these systems in their buildings in order to attract the tenants. That's the reality. And then you will control your destiny. As I mentioned, these systems are not very expensive. Where it does become very expensive is that if you have to install these in an existing building, right, a building that hasn't been built, where nothing's open, and you got to run the fiber up the riser, and then ultimately have it span out to the floors. I guess the reality that we're facing is that it's your tenants that are going to drive the demand for this. They're going to turn around and say, okay, I'm going to consider your building versus the guy across the street. His building's fully connected, it's brand new, yours is not. That's going to put you at a competitive disadvantage vis-a-vis the marketplace. But at the end of the day, as I'm going to look to lease space for a business, I'm going to look for a connected building. And that's how I'm going to decide where I go and take space.
I have a question regarding your presentation. You're talking about 7 billion devices that's going to be available or connected in the buildings or in environments. And we're talking about right now DAS, and we're talking about 5Gs. But how about IoT connectivity within the buildings?
You're 1,000% right. We're really at the infancy of it, and the systems that we're going to install in these buildings are going to need to have the capacity in order to allow for that interconnectivity, because we're all going to come to depend on it. In the workplace, there's a lot of things that, haven't even been thought of yet that ultimately are going to require connectivity. The greatest examples that I keep using is back to the home, where you just have all of these connected devices. But it's the same thing in buildings, in commercial buildings as much as residential. Everything's going to need to continue to operate seamlessly.
Any other questions? Got one more. Steven, you should be honored. Usually people are shy about doing this, so.
I just have a quick comment on the 5G. So I agree with you. 5G millimeter wave is very, very different than doing 5G on the low bands and the mid bands. But I want to make sure everybody understands you absolutely can do 5G on the low bands, 600 to 2.5 gigahertz, and the mid bands. And you can upgrade 4G systems today to 5G systems tomorrow pretty easily. So you can do 5G. It is very different, but you can do low, medium, and high.
I agree. It just depends on the standard that ultimately people are going to adopt in order to roll it out and what spectrum people will end up acquiring. What's interesting is we've seen markets in which 5G is already operating. So Helsinki is a great example. Finland has rolled out 5G in their downtown core, and you're getting almost a terabyte of download speeds in that market. And the way they're doing it is they're doing it with heavy node deployment in the market. So they're using the millimeter wave that they're using in order to do that is requiring a lot more points of presence. I don't know whether people are going to do it over the longer band waves, which is going to require that you can do over greater distances. You know, the way we've seen it in the markets that it's being tested in, it's requiring a lot more points of presence.
You haven't mentioned CBRS at all in terms of the 150 megahertz of wireless spectrum that the FCC just gave all property owners to ultimately leverage. Can you drill down on how CBRS fits into this and whether you can do 5G over CBRS and all that good stuff?
Now you're getting beyond my knowledge of whether you can or cannot. So I would maybe that gentleman has a view.
So yeah, you absolutely can. The 150 megahertz is a lot of bandwidth. Right now it's being rolled out as 4G LTE, but those systems can all be upgraded to 5G NR. And so yes, you absolutely can. Yep. I think it depends on what you're looking for. Manufacturing environments and other types of things where you're looking for very high bandwidth, 5G millimeter wave is going to get you what you're looking for. If it's a little bit less, like in commercial building, yeah, maybe 5G NR is the way to go with private LTE.
Well, John, the good news is we have a CBRS panel that we're doing. Mark Arinko is on that panel and a number of others here, but we will be discussing that, so that's a great question, and we will be talking about it. Any last questions? Stephen, you were terrific. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.